Paula.
Can everybody hear me okay in the back especially? I got a little microphone here, just making sure. Okay. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to Greg. Thank you to all the volunteers at the New Smyrna Museum. And thank you all for showing up. It's a great crowd here, so I hope I have a little bit here for everybody. I'm going to be moving around so people behind like pillars and stuff can see me. If you have any questions or anything at all throughout the presentation, feel free to raise your hand, call out, interrupt me at any point. I do not mind at all. I just want people to learn a bit about this, and if you leave here knowing anything that you didn't before, I'd feel happy. So, as Greg mentioned, I work for the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse. Right, we are just across the inlet from you guys over there. It's the tallest lighthouse in the state of Florida, one of the tallest in the whole country. Beautiful lighthouse, great museum. If you guys haven't gotten the chance to go over there, please go over at some point. You won't be disappointed. And so as part of my job over there, I'm the registrar and assistant curator. Basically, what I do over there is I deal with a lot of the history of the site. So history in our archives, our collections, and artifacts that we have, but also history in the exhibits and history with regards to like new things that are going on at the lighthouse, and like preserving the history and researching, new artifacts that come in, researching new things to go on display, all sorts of stuff. And so about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago or so, as part of one of our quarterly newsletters that we send out to our members, we had an article about Native American history in Florida, just because we hadn't done one in a long time, and there was an event coming up that had to do with Native Americans in Florida. So they asked me to write it because, as Greg mentioned, I studied history in school, then went on to do a master's in Florida history with an emphasis on Native Americans of Florida. So I'm very passionate about the subject, and from doing that one little newsletter article and then one little presentation that we did over there at the Lighthouse, suddenly we started getting calls from like libraries saying that, hey, nobody's ever done this before. Can you come out here and like present about this? And so, yeah, sure, absolutely, right? So I went out to the New Smyrna Library and then the Port Orange Library, and then other museums like the New Smyrna Beach Museum of History asked us to go and present. So I've been kind of touring all over Volusia County, teaching everybody about the natives of Volusia and most of Florida. So hopefully you enjoy. And again, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to interrupt me at any point. But without further ado, Timucua, or is it Timucua? That's often the first question I get even before the presentation starts. Is it Timucua? Is it Timucua? Is it Tomoka? Is it the Timucuans? I've heard it every which way that you can imagine. You might be wondering yourselves which is the correct way. The short answer is that they're all wrong. Pretty much all of them is wrong in some way, shape, or form. When I was a grad student, one of my professors always called them the Timucua, right? So that's what I said because she knew a lot more than me, and she called them Timucua, so that's what I went with. And then I moved over here to North Florida, and everybody here calls them the Timucua, right, or Timucuans, and I didn't know what was right, and then the more I learned about it, I realized that they're all not really the correct term. None of them are right, but that's the best term we have, so we'll get to that in a bit, but however you say it is probably fine enough, right? Let me make sure this clicker works. Let's see. Perfect. All right, so very briefly, what we're going to cover today are the indigenous populations of Florida. I like to personally break them down into 3 categories, 3 time periods. I've done this presentation a bunch of times, and then I added this slide in about halfway through because I felt like it helped people understand the timeline of what I'm going to be talking about. Because sometimes I'll be mentioning the Timucua, sometimes I'll talk about the Seminoles, sometimes I'll talk about mammoths and mastodons and stuff, and so it helps to kind of like frame your mind into when I'm talking about. So very roughly, we have 3 main periods of native history. This goes for pretty much all of Florida. So very, very early on, we have the prehistoric peoples of Florida, which I guess I should be using the so we have prehistoric peoples of Florida, roughly from about 13,000 BCE, which is just the fancy modern way of saying BCE, right? So 13,000 BCE to about 1513, right? It's a very specific date there, 1513, compared to 13,000. 13,000 is pretty much just when we have evidence of human beings in Florida, right? People have been in Florida for about 15,000 years, as far as we can tell. the caveat to all this is that the research is literally changing every day, every week. There's some new archaeological dig being found. And so as of right now, it appears that human beings migrated into Florida from the north. So here in like north to central Florida, human beings were here about 15,000 years ago, and then slowly started making their way down south. So down in like South Florida, we have evidence from about like 12, 13,000 years ago. But yeah, long time people have been in Florida. And then it pretty abruptly ends, this period right here, pretty abruptly ends in 1513. I'm not going to make you memorize any dates or anything, but just 1500s pretty much is when we get the arrival of Europeans, right? The Spanish specifically, right? 1513, everybody here has probably heard of Juan Ponce de Leon, right? They have a whole inlet named after him. Lighthouse, pretty sure you got Ponce in, it's on my shirt. So Juan Ponce de Leon, discoverer of Florida. Everybody thinks of the Fountain of Youth. That's a complete myth. But that's not what we're talking about today. So the Spanish come in here, and so from pretty much the 1500s, 1600s, and then a bit into the 1700s, the Spanish are here, the French are here, the British kind of come here. They come here and then they leave. The Dutch try and take over. The Europeans are in town, basically, in 1500s, 1600s, and then a bit of the 1700s, right? And then after this European period that I call it over here, from the 1700s onwards, then we get the group of peoples here that you all have probably heard of before if you grew up in Florida, lived in Florida for a long time, the Seminoles, right? So if I ask you right now, who are the Native Americans of Florida, most of you would probably say the Seminoles, right? You generally know of the Seminoles, you've heard of the Seminoles. If you're like me and grew up down in Miami, you probably went to field trips to Seminole little camps and Seminole villages as a kid, right? That's just where we used to go, besides like Disney World and the zoo and stuff. We'd go to Seminole villages. Also the Miccosukee people, they're very similar to the Seminoles. They kind of like branched off, so they have similar origins, but they're technically distinct. But it's basically Seminoles and Miccosukee people. They're all the way down in South Florida. We'll see why in a bit, but hopefully this helps you. This is kind of just the only dates really that I'm going to give you. So it's not going to be very date heavy, but just thousands of years ago into the 1500s, and then 1500s, 1600s, Spanish period, and then after that we get Seminoles. So if you ever hear me mention a named tribe, and it's not the Seminoles or the Miccosukee, it's in this 1500, 1600 period stretch. So whenever we're talking about Timucua, it's always going to be in the stretch, because prior to that, we just didn't have, we didn't have names for those. So it's just, those are the prehistoric peoples, and they're classified a different way. But let's get on to that. So this is one of those things where I was just talking about how this stuff is changing every day, and I do literally mean like every day, right? There's always, I see some new news article coming out about some skeleton found in Chile or Brazil or whatever, and then it redefines our definition of how human beings got to where they got. They originated in Africa, migrated to the Eurasian steppe, and then eventually made their way into the Americas. How did they make their way into the Americas? The most commonly accepted belief is people came over on this land bridge between what's now Russia and Alaska. They kind of just walked over it because it was frozen over. So they migrated over into the American continent and then kind of just like went into where they were going to go. That's still, as far as we can tell, it's pretty true, but there's always new things coming out. So now there's different theories about like island hopping in the Pacific, right? Different Polynesian peoples coming over via different islands, right? So there's also all sorts of stuff being discovered. So I'm not going to make any general claims, but suffice to say that people came to North America about 30,000 BC, give or take a couple thousand years. And during this period, or well, much later than this period, we have something called the Pleistocene epoch. It's basically just the time period that we were in. Florida was very wide, right? That's all you got to remember about this period. Florida was very wide, chunky, overgrown Florida, right? It's about double the size that it currently is. And so during this time, we had things like mammoths and mastodons and dire wolves. If anybody's here is a Game of Thrones fan, we had dire wolves in Florida. We had all sorts of like ground sloths and giant megafauna is what they're called, right? Megafauna just means megafauna, right? Large animals. We had tons of those in Florida. Here, specifically in like northeastern Florida, if you've been to like Moas, they have like ground sloth skeletons and like what are those, like giant armadillo type things with the protective shells. But there's all sorts of stuff that people would be amazed to find out lived in Florida. Things like California condors and paleo horses, right? Llamas and camels and all sorts of weird megafauna lived in Florida for thousands of years, and that's supposedly what brought humans to Florida. Humans were in search of these animals for things like food and the fur. So we have these people, they come to Florida, they hunt these animals. How do we know all this? How do you know I'm not just making this up and just inventing some story? Because of archaeology, right? We have proof of these things, right? I say that there were dire wolves and saber-toothed cats in Florida, not because I watched Ice Age and I want it to be true, but because we have evidence of that. There are dire wolf bones found in Volusia County and all over Florida, right? There are saber-toothed cat teeth found all throughout the state, and so we have a pretty decent understanding of some of these time periods, but of course that's constantly changing. And if you talk to an archaeologist, they'll, I'm sure, have a lot more to say about this, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this. So just know that people have been in Florida for thousands of years. Speaking of archaeology, these are some shell middens or shell mounds. What is a shell midden? What is a shell mound? It's basically what it sounds like. I'm going to stay more on this side because some people there may not be able to see me. But a shell mound is exactly what it sounds like. It is a mound of shells, right? What type of shells? It varies, right? So there's shells, there's oyster shells on the more marine side, right? The salty side along the eastern coast of Florida and western coast too. You have lots of like oyster shells and coquina shells and all sorts of other shellfish shells. And then on the like St. John's rivers and others interior waterways where it's freshwater, you have other types of shells, different types of shellfish, but still plenty of shells, and that accumulated over hundreds of years into these large mounds or middens. And these are wonderful for archaeologists because they show prolonged human inhabitation, right? If you're an archaeologist looking to study Native Americans in Florida that lived here 10,000 years ago, are you just going to randomly dig in the ground and hope you find something? Or do you go to the shell midden that we know was developed over hundreds of years and is very likely to have a ton of evidence of these dire wolf bones and all sorts of animal remains and human artifacts, human remains too, but a lot of tools naturally made out of shell because that's one of the materials that was most available back then. So you have lots of shell tools. You sometimes find things like dugout canoes, right? Which is basically a big trunk of a tree that they dig out the center from, and it's called a dugout canoe, and they use that pretty much as their method of transportation. So shell mound's really cool. Since we're in New Smyrna, I can't not talk about the shell mound that you guys have just south of us here in Canaveral National Seashore. If you go to Canaveral National Seashore, maybe like 10, 20 minutes south of here, they have Turtle Mound. Turtle Mound is the largest shell mound in the state of Florida. There aren't very many shell mounds left, and of the ones that are remaining, Turtle Mound is the largest. Yes, question.
Were these deliberately made, like they put all the
Great
garbage
question.
there and stuff like that?
Great question. Yes and no. Some of them were absolutely deliberately made. Others were just piles of trash, right? Let's say you're a prehistoric person in Florida, or even up to like the 1100 mark. We've had like Turtle Mound, I think, is from like 1100 AD, right, BC or CE, 1100 to about like or 800 to 1100. So it's only 500, 600 years ago that it was being developed. And some of them were purposely built for different purposes. There are some that are burial mounds, right? Typically people, when they think of like Native American mounds, they think of like, ooh, spooky burial mounds, right? There are a few that were specifically for some burial purposes, and we know that because lots of skeletons are found in them. But as a whole, there might be a skeleton found in one of those, but it's just, there's all sorts of stuff found in them. So you might have some that are used for like a hunting location, right, or a fishing location. So they lived more inland, but this is where they went to fish. And so naturally, over the course of like 200 years, all the shellfish and bones and everything that they caught kind of accumulated in this one little area, because that's their like fishing grounds and hunting grounds. That's where they would go and see where, you know, where they would go fish for the day. Some of them were even used as points of like navigation, right? If you're on a very flat Florida coastline and then suddenly you see a little bump, right? That's a useful point. You know, like, oh, once you see the mound, make left, right? So that's, even the Europeans started using that. Turtle Mound specifically, right? The ones along the coast. But even some of the interior waterways ones, right? You come across a fork in the road, right? And all these forks, I'm sure, not the road, but a fork in the river, and one of them has a mound, right? The directions could be follow the mound or something like that. And then aside from the ones that we kind of sort of know the purpose, there's also a lot of question marks with these. There's, again, research being done every day about this. I was just corresponding with a professor over in Central Florida who's like researching the mounds over there in like the St. Johns River. I saw a presentation he did like 2 months ago, and so I had some questions for him, so I was emailing him. So there's more work being done all the time. They're finding new things, but yes, they're deliberately made, but there are others that were just accumulated. They're fascinating stuff. There's a whole lot more that can be talked about them, but we'll get to that later if anybody has any more questions. But if not, let's move on to the Timucua, right? The namesakes of this presentation. The Timucua, Timucuan, however you want to call them, they are not one particular group, right? That's why I'd say that it's kind of all wrong, right? It's not really Timucua, it's not really Timucua, it's not really Timucuans, right? It's about 13, 14, 15 different groups that all lived in this north central Florida area that all kind of got this umbrella term of Timucua applied to them, right? So why do we still use that term today? Because there's no better term, right? There's no better term we can get specific and talk about like the saltwater peoples and the freshwater peoples and the Potanos and the Aquetas and the Utinas and all sorts of little different groups in there. And if you go to certain places, they might do that. Like I know some of the state parks over there have like a particular tribe that lived in that area. Like I think in De Leon Springs, they have I want to say it's the Aqueta people or Potano people. And so they talk specifically about that one group. But as a whole, we kind of just lump them together, not because I want to lump them together, but because there's no real better way of me describing them to you right now other than the Timucua, right? And if you look up a map of the Timucua territory, right, not that it was one homogeneous group, but if you just look up Timucua territory, you're going to find a lot of different maps online. Some of them go all the way down to like central, like Orlando area. Some of them extend far into the Panhandle. Others are like halfway through Georgia and stuff. So it's roughly this northeast Florida area, kind of all over the place. Different tribes lived in different areas, but together these tribes became the Timucua. They're pretty much the descendants of these prehistoric peoples that I was talking about that have been in Florida for thousands of years. Those people eventually became the Timucua, right? So prior to Europeans, we didn't have names for these people because they didn't have a written language, right? They had language, they communicated with each other, they talked, the human beings communicate, always have, but they did not have any sort of alphabet system. They didn't have writing in the same sense that we have today. So all their language was all spoken, so we don't really have any recordings, any writings of anything prior to European arrival, right? So in the world of history, right, basically history is anything that's been recorded. So technically anything prior to the 1500s when the Europeans arrived, that's all considered pre-history because it's pre-written language, all in the state of Florida at least, right? Not worldwide, just in the state of Florida prior to 1500s. We just don't have written sources, right? And then the Spanish come and the French come, and then suddenly you start having them writing their accounts about their interactions with the Timucua and with the Calusa down in South Florida and with all sorts of other groups. And then those interactions are then what has built half of our understanding of these peoples, right? Half of it comes from archaeology, and then the other half comes from these European sources, right? So, what else we got? Yeah, population size. A lot of people are surprised to find out the size of these people. They were about 150,000 to 250,000 in the northeast Florida area. Total of Florida would have been, oh man, what was the total? Total of Florida was around 300,000 to 350,000, according to some very intelligent historians that I've researched. But again, take those numbers with a grain of salt. It's very difficult, but it's a lot lower than other places in the New World that Europeans came and colonized, like Mexico and South America, right, with the Inca and the Aztecs and all sorts of other groups that had a lot larger population centers, some numbering in the few millions. So, yeah. Let's talk about the Timucua, and let's talk about the Spanish and the Europeans that came, and how do we get the Timucua term, right? So, 1500s, 1513 to be precise. Juan Ponce de Leon comes, discovers Florida, even though there's already a few 100,000 people living here, but he comes to Florida, names it after La Pascua Florida, right, the Easter holiday, right? Supposedly it was right on Easter when he discovered it, and so it becomes La Isla Florida, the island of Florida, except it's not an island, but never mind. So we get Florida, 1513, and then the first real settlement in Florida only comes in 1563, right? That's a 50-year gap right there. Most other places that the Spanish colonized in this new world of theirs, in the Caribbean, right? A lot of these different Caribbean islands like Puerto Rico and Cuba and Saint Domingue and all these places, they like discovered and colonized like literally the same year or a couple months later. Like one guy finds it and then goes home and then brings back a colony, and they establish a colony, and so all those places are like 1400s and early 1500s. But Florida, they come to Florida and then kind of abandon it for 50 years and then come back 50 years later. Why is that?
Disease?
Disease is a good guess. That is true. There's a lot of disease in Florida at the time. It kills about 70% of the Europeans that come over here, which is pretty bad. But it also kills about 90 to 95% of the population of the Americas. So disease is definitely super rampant. And over the course of like 200 years, kills a ton of people, literally millions of people throughout this new world. But there's disease in the Caribbean too. There's disease in all of these islands, right? So it's not, right, it's basically the Europeans bringing their European diseases and then contracting a lot of the American diseases that neither side had immunity towards, and so did not end up well for either side, but was especially worse for the Native American side. But disease was everywhere, right? There was disease all over the place. So the reason European, or Spain specifically, didn't really care about Florida at the time is because Florida was worthless. Florida had nothing of real value to them, I might add. Florida had swampy lands, right? It had hostile natives, right? A bunch of the groups, maybe not so much here in North Florida, but like in South Florida, the Calusa especially, were known to be very hostile towards some of the Spaniards, right? They started off friendly and then did not end up friendly. So why would they come to Florida where A, there's no gold and silver, B, there's hostile natives everywhere, C, there's mosquitoes literally everywhere, right? When they could go to like Cuba or Puerto Rico or anywhere else and try and establish colonies there, right? Or maybe they could go to like around the Mexico area or the South America area where there's already large established cities, right, producing things like gold and silver, and they can just kind of like take over the thing, and instead of having to create a whole thing from scratch, they could just kind of take over Tenochtitlan or take over some of the Incan cities down in the Andes and just kind of like funnel all that gold back into Europe. Florida had none of that, right? So they kind of just didn't really care too much about Florida. They tried establishing some colonies, didn't work out too well, so they kind of just left, right? Kind of just didn't really put their entire effort behind it. Until, that is, 1563. Why? Because of the French, right? The French come over, and the French decide to establish a little fort over here, right? And it's not even like France as a whole, right? It's a very specific group of French called the Huguenots, right? They are Protestants in a very Catholic world, right? Especially in Catholic France back then. So these are some Protestants, and they're looking for peace and religious freedom, the same thing that we learn in school about the Quakers and the Pilgrims and the early American pioneers that come over on the Mayflower and are looking to establish a new world over here where they're free from religious persecution. Same thing happened all over Europe. So you have these Huguenot Protestants coming to Florida, try and establish their little town over here in Florida. So they built this Fort Carolyn, and then that's when the Spanish decide to go, no, we're going to take that back, right? And so they come and they destroy Fort Carolyn, and basically 2 years later, 1564, the Fort Carolyn is 1563, the French come here, 1564, they establish Fort Carolyn, and in 1565, the Spanish have burned it all down, and they've built their own little city called St. Augustine. Right, so the oldest city in the United States, pretty much, St. Augustine, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the United States, St. Augustine, built right next to a river called the Rio de Matanzas. Right, so this river over here that we have next to it, this Halifax River, the intercoastal, pretty much, it's not really a river, it's more like an estuary, but this river of the Halifax that we have here continues north and becomes eventually the Rio Matanzas, right? Matanzas River, we have Matanzas Inlet. What does Matanzas mean in Spanish? Massacre, slaughter, yeah. So the Spanish come, kill all the French, establish their little town. So no more Fort Carolyn. There have been archaeological excavations nowadays trying to find Fort Carolyn. Supposedly they found it, but there's controversy about it. But Fort Carolyn no longer there. There's a recreation of it, I think, in St. Augustine, but French come into town. When the French come into town, that's when we get our first real look at the Timucua. Right, we have supposedly here French explorer and Timucua chief, right, talking to each other. The French come in, these Huguenots, right, led by an explorer named René Laudonnière, and they have some, like an artist that goes with them named Jacques Lemoyne, right, and so these French Huguenots come in, they learn a bit about the land, they determine, yes, this is where we want to establish our little town. They meet with the Timucua are somewhat receptive of them. There's, I mean, not completely peaceful, there's still some fighting that goes on, there's still a lot of, blood that happens, but as a whole, they're a lot more receptive than like South Florida groups. So the French kind of like take this information, they write letters back home, they write in their journals about what they've encountered in their voyage to Florida, and that's actually where we get the term Timucua from. Right, basically, let me see, is there another picture? This is Chief Saturiwa, right? He is the chief of the, I believe he was the saltwater peoples, right? So remember I said there were like 13, 14, 15 different groups of the Timucua here. Chief Saturiwa was chief of one of those groups. They were called the saltwater peoples. They're based out of like that area just north of us in like the mouth of this, or below the mouth of St. John, by like the St. Augustine area. So these saltwater peoples, the agua salada people in Spanish, they were led by Chief Saturiwa. Chief Saturiwa apparently did not like the chief of the freshwater peoples that was over here in the east coast of Volusia County, right, that there's saltwater peoples up north, freshwater peoples down here, Chief Saturiwa over there, Chief Utina down here. Chief Saturiwa talks to the French and says something about Chief Utina being a Timogonia. What does Timogonia mean? No clue. Nobody knows. No idea. Could be very polite, could be extremely offensive. I have no clue. Right? Nobody knows. I've asked specific to Timucua linguists, right? They're like 3 or 4 people in this world that are actively studying and have PhDs in this and are teaching classes about this in the University of Florida and stuff. I've asked them explicitly, what does Timucua mean? And just nobody knows. It is one of those words. There's a lot of words out there that we just don't know in various Native American languages. And fortunately, we don't know what Timucua means, but it comes from this Timogonia, right? So Chief Saturiwa, this guy, calls Chief Utina a Timogonia. French leave, right, or are slaughtered. French are gone. Spanish come in. Now we're in like the 1590s, right? So like 30 years later, Spanish are in town, right? They, Spanish Florida, they control Florida for a couple of centuries. And now the Spanish are here, and they remember reading something somewhere about some guy being a Timogonia, and he was Utina, and something, and then they come across a group called the Utina, and so suddenly, oh yeah, Timogonia, they're the Timucuas, perfect, and so the term kind of just gets applied to everybody. So we have the Timucua, right, because this group was called the Utinas, and this chief was called Utina, and this chief was called the Timogonia, and they're called the Utinas, suddenly everybody's Timogonias, everybody's Timucua, because they all kind of look similar, they all kind of wear the same clothing or lack of clothing, they all kind of have similar tattoos, they have a similar way of life, they speak a similar dialect, so they just kind of all get lumped together into this group of Timucua, Timucuan, Timuconia, Tomoka is a variation of it. You might have seen Tomoka State Park or the Tomoka River or Tomoka Basin. There's all sorts of stuff named after the Timucua. There you have it. That's how we get the term Timucua. That's why it's not really correct, but we don't really have a better term, so we kind of still use that term today, and that's what we have. So there's Chief Saturiwa. Here we have supposedly the Timucua in a dugout canoe, similar to this, except slightly different design. So the Timucua over here, that's how they got around, right? What is something wrong with this image that you might notice? We're going to talk a lot about these images now, which I'm sure you've seen before, but we're going to talk about some of them. We got some hills or mountains or something in the background, right? We'll talk a bit more about them. This one supposedly shows the Timucua men hunting deer, right? So you see they kind of like crouch down in a deer pelt, kind of like put deer, things on them in order to sweat deer blood and deer excrement on them in order to kind of blend in better with the natural world, and then they get real close to the deer and then hunt them. Very interesting look at their day-to-day life. What is this, right? So this is I put this here because it's a page from a book, naturally. And this is where a lot of these images that I've just shown you and will continue to show you are from, right? This is a book produced in the late 1500s, so a long time ago. And this book has probably comprised most of our knowledge of the Timucua up until the 20th century, when we started getting actual professional archaeology done into their lives and their history and their day-to-day, and what types of foods they ate and what types of clothes they wore and how they lived, and even things like bone densities can tell you about how what sources of food they ate, and teeth size can tell you about all sorts of stuff that archaeologists can figure out. But for a long time, this was it, right? So this is one page from a book published in like 1591 or 92 or something like that, late 1500s, by a man named Theodore de Bry. Right? So de Bry never stepped foot in the Americas. Right? That's problem number one. Right? This guy never ever came to the Americas, right? And yet he published a book supposedly relaying the adventures and stories and the first encounters of the French that were here, right? Specifically this one guy named Jacques Lemoyne, right? So Jacques Lemoyne was a French Huguenot. He was on one of these voyages to Florida. He did come here. He managed to escape the Spanish slaughter of the French. He managed to make it back into France. And then when he got back to France, there was another slaughter over there of Huguenots, this time by the Catholics. So he flees that. I think it was like the St. Bartholomew's Day or some massacre over there, flees to, I think, London this time, and then that's when De Vries basically gets his journal from either his estate or from his widow. He acquires Lemoyne's drawings, right? Because Lemoyne was an artist, a natural engraver, and would record what he saw and had notes about his voyage and what they saw, right? Because at this time, most Europeans, the vast majority of Europeans, had no idea about anything in the New World. So this was pretty interesting information to have. So this guy purchases it, and he's an engraver, he's a publisher, he prints stuff for money. So what does he do? He turns this into some hot piece of gossip, prints it out, and we get this book. It's got a really long title. It's something about the American Indian and blah, 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 and whatever. But it's basically our first look at these native Floridians, specifically the Timucua, because that's where with the French encountered. So we have, basically it'd be like the plate number, right, the title, right, something, something crocodilian, right, because this one was published in German. And then we have the number of the plate, the etching, right, or engraving, and then like a caption that supposedly comes from Lemoyne or one of the other French explorers like René Ladonnière or some other guy. And so, there are words about what they saw, and then the drawing of it, and that's it. That's supposedly what we saw. However, look at this and tell me what's wrong with it. It's a large, very large crocodile or alligator, yet gigantic, right, number one. You see people here are much, much smaller, right, than this massive alligator. Second of all, this guy's got cute little teddy bear ears. He's got long fingers. He's got leg muscles that look like human. It looks like little baby legs or something. Very, very difficult. But supposedly this is showing how the Timucua would basically impale the crocodile from the mouth, or the alligator from the mouth, flip it over onto its back, and then apparently shoot it with arrows and stuff, and that's how they'd hunt alligator. But clearly whoever drew this has never really seen an alligator. So you would not think that it'd be Jacques Lemoyne, a renowned naturalist who's known for his very scientific looking drawings and who actually came to Florida and saw alligators and saw the Timucua and stuff, compared to De Vries, who had never stepped foot in Florida and published and made money from all these different prints, right? So here's a depiction of what the natives, right, the Timucua would be eating. So you have all sorts of different fish and snakes and iguanas and critters and whatever, and so it's kind of like an early barbecue system. I'm not kidding, barbecue actually comes from the barbacoa, right? It's a Caribbean word, I believe. I forget which exact root, I think it might be the Carib people, but it's a very new world thing to barbecue their foods. This one is great, this is a fantastic one. So it supposedly shows a Timucua village, right? There's just one giant thing wrong with this. What can anybody tell me what the giant thing, the glaring mistake with this thing is? The fence! There is zero evidence of this anywhere in Florida, right? That's just not, it didn't happen here. There's no, I mean, I don't know, there might be, if you can find one in the ground, you probably get a lot of recognition for finding something like this, but there's no evidence of this. There's no archaeologist or archaeological excavation has ever found any sort of walled fortification, some encampment designed to protect a wooden palisade around a Timucua town. That's just not a thing that happened in Florida. But to a European who kind of envisions a town with a protective wall around it, right, that's what you would imagine a city looking like, right? So a little embellishment was made. This one's great. A couple things wrong with this, right? First and foremost, right, so supposedly this is Chief Utina and Chief Saturiwa over here, right, the two hated rivals, apparently. Right, one of them is a Timugonia, whatever that means. Going at it, right? They're doing battle right now. Except, number one, again, rolling hills in the background, right? Not really a Florida thing. Right? I don't know what hills or mountains or whatever you've seen in Florida, but I have not. Secondly, this one, yeah, well, it's Mount Dora, I believe, is a shell midden. A lot of these places that are slightly higher elevations, especially along the coast, have shell middens. So like Turtle Mountain is just the biggest example, but there's a couple. There's Seminole Rest over there. Mount Dora is one. Over in Ponce Inlet, Ponce used to be Ponce Park, but Ponce Inlet, where I work, there is a place called Green Mound over there. If you've ever been to the Lighthouse, you have driven right next to Green Mound. There's mounds all over the state, but not too many left, unfortunately, especially in South Florida. A lot of them have gone. We'll get to that in a bit, but so what else is wrong with it? We've got rolling hills over there, right? Not sand dunes, not shell middens, but just straight up hills. The size of these armies is ridiculous, right? Remember I said that there was a grand total of maybe 150,000 to 250,000 in all of North Florida, right? And you're telling me that they had giant, massive armies with hundreds, if not thousands of people on either side doing a pitch battle in wide open plains? That's not a thing that happened in Florida, right? Experts have researched different warfare tactics in Florida, and the general consensus is that it was more like little hit and run type skirmishes, right? They would go in early in the morning, or maybe later in the day, just after sunrise or just before sunset, go in, take some captives, escape, try not to get too many casualties, right? Because these are small villages, small collective units of maybe a few hundred over here, a few thousand in this group, so you're not going to have the population to support massive standing armies, right? Where do you have massive standing armies and big open pitch battles and wide open fields and stuff? Europe. In Europe, right? So again, right, this is something you might see in Europe, but definitely not in Florida. Another little thing, but this club right here is not a club that's found in Florida, right? There's a historian that actually did research on this particular club, and it's something that's found more in Brazil, so you're not going to find this type of club. There's other little details like that too, besides, weird alligators and hills in the background and big open pitch battles and, fake fortifications and stuff like that. There's little tiny things that historians pick up on, like there's the type of shell that's used in one of the drawings is actually incorrect, right? It's there's lots of shells used in the Native American world here in Florida, and the one particular type of shell that was used in one of these drawings is one that's found in the Pacific, so would never be over here. What else do we got? This one's great. Does anybody know what these people are doing?
Fishing.
Fishing, scalloping? Nope, not it. What are they doing over here, right? You have a bunch of Timucua men, everybody perfectly chiseled, right? Muscles all over them, right? They are panning for gold in Florida. What? There's no gold in Florida, right? I even double-checked to make sure. I looked up where the closest font of gold is to the state of Florida. It's all the way high up in the Appalachians, right? It had nothing to do with Florida. But yet, if the Europeans are looking for gold in the Americas, right, clearly the native populations must be looking for gold, right? Of course, right? Doesn't make sense, but why wouldn't you look for gold? So we have depictions of them panning for gold, which we know they never did. There's zero evidence of this anywhere, and yet there's a whole slide, a whole engraving teaching the public in Europe about their gold, search for gold, and they're going to hide it from us, and we got to take the gold, and all this sorts of stuff. This one's probably my favorite. They are showing Timucuan men taking wounded soldiers from battle. Only, in my opinion, these guys kind of look like members of Led Zeppelin, right? Or Isaac Newton. I've heard Isaac Newton too. So clearly some very European-looking figures in place of what would be Timucuan men, Timucua soldiers. Again, on a hill for some reason. And then we get to the more sad part of these engravings, right? It's the depictions like this one where, what do you think these people are doing? Dancing around in a circle, naked. This guy's talking to one of the French explorers, right? What are they doing? Human sacrifice, right? Sacrificing babies. These bloodthirsty, cannibals. These terrible, terrible human beings, right? This is the type of stuff that's sold books and papers and print in Europe, right? Does anybody over there, back in the 1500s and 1600s, do people there want to read about the different types of pottery sherds that are found in Florida and how the Czech stamped pattern and the St. John stamped pattern are similar? But no, people don't want to read about that. They want to read about women sacrificing their firstborn children in order to please some weird god, and that's the stuff that's sold, right? That's the Hollywood of the 1500s and 1600s. So that's what gets propagated over there, regardless of its veracity, right? Regardless of how accurate and true these claims were, they just kind of took one report of some attack or some sacrifice or something over there, and then they turn it into a whole movie, like Apocalypto, right? They turn it into this whole thing, and even today you think, oh my God, those Aztecs that are sacrificing and doing crazy, ripping out hearts through the what, right? That's the kind of stuff that's interesting to people, right? It's not, different pottery styles. It's all about sacrifices and human sacrifices and whatever. Never mind the fact that over in Europe, what's going on in the 1500s and 1600s?
Burning witches.
Yeah, much worse than burning witches, right? There's literal medieval torture devices going on. There's wars of religion going on in that time, right? Protestant reformations going on. There's literal torture devices being invented at all times over there in Europe. Absolutely barbaric things, but this is the stuff that causes a lot of people to demonize these that they do not know in the New World. And so this is unfortunately something that is a recurrent theme, not just in the 1500s and 1600s. It keeps going all the way, present times, but especially in the founding of the United States, you have the United States naturally is encroaching upon various different Native American tribes, not just in Florida, but all over. You get things like the Trail of Tears, and of course, what are the newspaper reports coming back into American towns with regards to these? Is it that, we've gone and... Is it that we've gone and, eradicated them from their village? Or is that, one of those dirty whatever scalped one of our people and, displayed it as a trophy? How could they're so barbaric? Right, so horrible stuff, horrible things going on at the time, basically. And then that's what gets reported and that's what sells papers, right? But then to fast forward quite a few centuries, or not really, but eventually the Timucua, as you might I've noticed, right, there's not a Timucua tribe today. There's not a group of Timucua today, right? We call them Timucua because that's the term we have for them, and if they were around today for us to call them something differently, that'd be great. I'd ask them what they prefer to be called, but they're not here, right? So where did they go? Kind of mentioned it earlier already, but most of them, 90 to 95% of not just the Timucua, not just the groups in Florida, but literally the entire American and South American continent, 90 to 95%, right? An astronomical number, died due to various diseases brought over, right? Things like smallpox, influenza, a few other ones. Horrible stuff. That's a huge percentage of people to die off in the span of about 200 years or so, right? But still, that leaves a few people left, right? So there were a few Timucua that survived throughout this time, or continued passing on their genes throughout this time. And eventually, there's another group called the Seminoles that are integral to Florida history, right? However which way you look at it, Seminoles are absolutely vital to Florida history. They can trace their origins to places up north of Florida, things like Georgia and South Carolina and that area there, about even parts of like Alabama, I think. Different groups called the Creeks and the Muskagees. They, during the 1600s, but mainly 1700s, as the British are in town, and then the British establish a little thing called the 13 colonies, right? And then those start growing, and so they start expelling these Muskagees and Creeks and stuff from their lands. So a lot of them flee west, and then a lot of them flee south, right? Florida was this backwater place where there just really wasn't much commerce going on, other than like St. Augustine and Key West. Those are pretty much the two main towns along Florida, and the reason for that is that they pass right along the Gulf Stream. So all the gold and silver that was mined in the South America, Central America region, all the sugar and rum and tobacco and products that were produced in the Caribbean, in order to get back to Europe, right, which they obviously wanted it back in Europe, in order to get back to Europe, it had to pass right next to Florida. So that's why Florida was valuable. It wasn't for the land itself, but it was for the location of Florida and how it was right next to the superhighway that got all these goods back to Europe. So piracy was very rampant in Florida, as you can imagine, all this gold and silver and sugar and rum and everything going back to Europe. Lots of valuable ships going through. That's why there's lots of shipwrecks, right? We have a whole treasured coast here in Florida, lots and lots of shipwrecks, right? Hence the need for lighthouses, which we now have plenty of. And so, I'll be honest, I forgot where I was going with this. Let's see. Seminoles, there we go, right? So we get these, the Spanish are here, they're sending all the goods back. The native populations have mostly died out. The Seminoles, well, at this point they weren't Seminoles, they were Muskogee and Creeks. They were fleeing west. They were fleeing into Florida because Florida was kind of abandoned, right? Other than those key little cities, they had lots of piracy going on, lots of runaway slaves from places like Georgia and the Carolinas, right? You could flee elsewhere, or you can go to Florida, which is not an American colony at this time. So you flee to Florida, and Florida's kind of like the wild, wild west, but down south. And so eventually these become known as like these castaway, runaway type, lawless, like savage things, right? And that's where we get the word cimarrones from, right? The Spanish word, same root word where we get marooned. If you're marooned on an island, you kind of become this like wild thing stranded on an island, right? So cimarrones, it's a little bit hard to say if you can't roll your R's like a Spaniard. So cimarrones becomes cimanoles, and that's where we get Seminoles from, the Seminole word from. So Seminoles, I like to think of them as kind of this amalgamation of different tribes. They have roots in some of these tribes that came in from the north. They have, as they came into Florida, they kind of like picked up stragglers of the Timucua and of the very, very many other groups in Florida, like the Tocobaga and the Calusa and the Tequesta, the Mainaimi, all sorts of groups, and they kind of like merged with them into this Seminole group that we now know today. So I've talked to members of the Seminole tribe. I've like directly called them up and asked them to make sure I'm not like misrepresenting anything. I called it. They have a museum down in South Florida, the Atatiki Museum, and I've asked how they interpret this story, and they basically gave me that whole story just as I presented it here. They're very adamant that they are this they didn't come to Florida in the 1700s. They have been in Florida for thousands of years because they are also descendants of these people that lived in Florida for thousands of years and then were kind of stranded here when more groups came from the north and kind of merged together. So the Seminoles are kind of this mix of northerners that came and also indigenous Florida groups. But again, there's no Seminoles here in North Florida, right? There's of course Seminole people here, but there's not like a unified Seminole group here in North Florida. Where are the Seminoles today? Seminoles are Everglades, right? South Florida, right? They're all the way down there, right? But I just said they came from the north, right? And they came over here. What happened to them to get them all the way down into South Florida? Little things called the Seminole Wars, right? Technically there's 3 of them, first, second, third Seminole War. Really it's more just like one long war that kind of like blends into each other. It's pretty much the early 1800s, the United States at this point. Now we have the United States, right? 1776, the United States is formed. They start expanding west and south and manifesting destiny in all sorts of places. You have presidents like Andrew Jackson, right, where we get Jacksonville, who like basically invades Florida even before Florida is American, right? Just kind of like dips into Florida and like massacres some people and then continues on his way in like the War of 1812 as he's trying to get to New Orleans, right? So all sorts of stuff going on. Lots of Georgia settlers complaining about their Georgia plantation owners complaining about their slaves running away, going to Florida, this lawless backwater, wild, wild west type of place. So eventually the United States has to put an end to this, right? So they got to go over there and pacify Florida. So they come down into Florida, they eradicate the natives, it's a bit weird. They make all sorts of deals, and then they renege on some of those deals, and then of course the Seminoles attack back, and then that's what gets put in the newspapers. Seminoles have attacked, and they massacre people, and then suddenly story goes this, story goes that, and at the end of the day, the Seminoles are pushed further and further south. So throughout the 3 Seminole Wars in the 1800s, the early 1800s, prior to the Civil War, basically the Seminoles are pushed further and further and further south until they're pretty much in the Everglades, and then once they're in the Everglades, that's fine, right? Their numbers have been mostly eradicated. They've lost, I forget the percentage, but it's a significant chunk of their population. Some have fled to other places, like the Bahamas, surprisingly, has a very large, or relatively large Seminole population. There's like Bahamian Seminoles, right? Because you had like runaway slaves that had Bahamian roots, and then so they join the Seminoles and then flee towards the Bahamas. So you have Seminoles over there. Some of them make treaties with the United States and agree to relocate out west, and so you have Seminole groups in like Oklahoma and places like that. And then some of them say, no, we're staying here and we're not going anywhere. And so the Seminoles are very proud of the fact that they are supposedly the one group in all American history that never fully surrendered to the United States, right? They're little groups that might have, agreed to relocate and whatever, but the Seminoles as a whole, as a tribe, never fully surrendered to the United States. And so they eventually were pushed all the way down into South Florida, where they still are today. But they have done remarkably well for themselves in the time since. Seminoles are they're leaders in a lot of Native American issues. There's a lot of horrible stuff going on, Native American issues around the country, lots of poverty, lots of terrible, terrible things, and mismanagement, and racism, and all sorts of stuff. But the Seminoles do fairly well for themselves. All the way back in like the 50s, I believe, they organized as a tribe, and then throughout this entire time, they've been doing sorts of like roadside attractions. They've embraced Florida's #1 moneymaker, which is tourism. So they've been doing roadside attractions since well into the 1800s, and even especially early 1900s when you get a big population boom in Florida. So things like alligator wrestling, like, oh, right? They don't do that for real, but that's what the tourists want to see, right? They want to see these massive, teddy bear-eared alligators with long fingernails, they want to see it grappling. There's footage of like Seminoles like grappling with alligators in like the 50s and stuff. It's weird to see by today's standards. They're just like messing with it. But so Seminoles have done fairly well for themselves. They now own all the Hard Rock cafes in the world, I think, except the one in Las Vegas. They are, I believe they're the ones that pioneered some of the like casinos and gambling and stuff. They were the ones that fought for that in the American courts back in like I want to say the 70s. Advocating that it's their lands, their reservation, it's not American land, they should be able to do what they want within. So that led the way for a lot of other Native American groups doing their own casinos and stuff like that. Seminoles are a very interesting group, right? And in case some people are wondering, because I know that lately there's been controversy about different like group names and using different indigenous groups as mascots, right? There was like the Redskins, the Washington Redskins that changed their name, and then the Cleveland Indians, and there's like those are the ones that a lot of people know of, but there are a million others of these that are like high school level and below that are a lot more like the Savages, right, and stuff. So like imagine your high school is just like, we're the Savages, right, and it's got like a Native American with like a mohawk and scalping stuff as the mascot. So not great. So yeah, little by little those things are changing, but the Seminole group, right, the Seminole FSU, right, football group, that's a different story entirely. So I always like pointing that out at the end because they have deep relations with the Seminole tribe. The Seminole tribe is active with FSU in some capacity. They send a lot of Seminole like youths to FSU. They are present in, I believe, every one of the games. Like it's not just some random little mascot dressing up as a Seminole going, doing like a caricature or whatever. It's an actual Seminole member doing Seminole things. So very interesting group. And Seminoles are more like 1800s onwards. Prior to that, there were people that could later identify themselves as Seminoles, but they just weren't known as the Seminoles until about pretty much 1700s, but especially 1800s onwards. So if you are in the museum and you see pictures of old Florida, you'll see a lot of the Seminoles, right? Because that's when we started getting photography in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So you start seeing like Seminoles trading with some of the early white pioneers. And so there's a lot, especially in South Florida, you see a lot of that. Here in Volusia County specifically, we have a lot to do with the Seminoles because during the Second Seminole War specifically, there was a lot of Seminole attacks in this area. So you may have noticed there's a couple of sugar mill ruins around town, right? There's one over here, the Kruger de Peister one in New Smyrna. There's Dunlawton Sugar Mill over in Port Orange. There's one in Ormond. There's another one somewhere else, I forget where. So there's a couple of these sugar mills. So these are plantations, right, run by various plantation owners in the 1800s. And then during the Second Seminole War, the Seminoles go, free the slaves, attack the plantations, burn the stuff down to the ground. They attacked different places in New Smyrna. They attacked the lighthouse that was here. So there was a lighthouse here in New Smyrna prior to this beautiful lighthouse that's over on the Ponce Inlet side. There was a smaller lighthouse built here in 1835, and that lasted until 1836, right? Less than 1 year later, the Seminole War started. But the Seminoles didn't destroy the lighthouse, but there was a war going on. They came to the lighthouse, but the lighthouse was kind of abandoned. It's already kind of like tipping over at that point. It's a very poorly built lighthouse. But who's going to go out to repair a crooked lighthouse in the middle of a war, right? Nobody. So they kind of just let it fall. And then after Seminole Wars end in like the 1840s, right, Seminoles are relocated down south. Then you get the Civil War in the 1860s, and so then nobody's going to come build a lighthouse in the middle of a Civil War. So, do you have a question?
I noticed that their dress, did they have crops that they harvested to make their own?
That's a fascinating question for a couple different reasons. So, one, you're pointing out the Seminole dress, like what they're wearing basically. They have Seminole jackets, they have different dresses. That's actually a world famous pattern. Like I have an aunt in Brazil that does like patchwork and knitting and sewing and all sorts of stuff, and that's like, there's like this Seminole patchwork is a thing that's known in knitting communities worldwide, and it's a very specific type of pattern. That, I believe, is something that came a little bit later when they started trading with various groups. They kind of adapted the clothing that they had and mixed in a lot of these patterns that were brought in by some of the white settlers and mixed them to form all sorts of different patterns. And some had looked like lightning bolts, others are different lines. And so it's not like a particular crop that they farmed and then used that to build the clothing. It's a lot of trading. There was a lot of trading networks going on with the early white settlers, and so that actually defined a lot of like the 1800s and early 1900s for Florida in general. There's lots of different trade patterns between the settlers that are arriving and trying to live in Florida, and then the Seminoles that have been here for thousands of years, but especially in the last 100 years or so, and they trading with these, providing food to the settlers, and the settlers provide things like guns back or medicine or cloth, right, or things like that. But because you mentioned agriculture, I'll throw that out. Agriculture now is very big in Florida. You have, especially the center of Florida, is very big on agriculture. But throughout these thousands of years that Florida was inhabited, they didn't really have too much agriculture, right? Which is, like, it doesn't sound that interesting. I can appreciate that, but that's a pretty unique thing in the world of anthropology, is that the fact that they didn't have agriculture, right? If you think of like human beings developing tens of thousands of years ago, right? We discover fire, and then pretty soon we start farming, right? And so all over the world, different groups start develop how to grow crops and everything. In Florida, it's not that they didn't develop it, they didn't know how, or they didn't want to, or anything like that. There was just so much food available everywhere that in South Florida especially, they had no need for that. When you could just go out and catch a bunch of mullet, or catch a bunch of other types of fish, or shellfish, or hunt a manatee, right? It's pretty slow moving, they're not gonna fight back, right? Hunt a manatee, hunt a whale, get some dolphins, eat some birds. You know how many birds were in Florida, right? Just set up a trap, wait for a duck to fly in. Right? So they just didn't need agriculture, and so of course they would collect certain plants that they found. In North Florida, they had limited forms of agriculture. The Timucua had some limited forms of agriculture, but nowhere near as much as you would imagine. A lot of other places that actively harvested crops and planted, sowed fields and planted crops and stuff like that. I find that fascinating. Thank you, Greg, again for having me. Thank you guys for coming. I hope you learned something.